Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Harley Schlanger. Harley is an historian, a national spokesman. He's been covering the financial industry since the 80s for LaRouche PAC, and I am very happy to have Harley back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Harley, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Hi, Dave. Good to be with you.
Hey, thanks for being here. And I want to start off with what is happening with the Mueller report, because we've heard a lot about it. Trump's been tweeting out a lot about it, that the Mueller report came out and there's no collusion, no obstruction. But Trump, very interestingly, continually tweets out that he wants to know how this all started, because he always, said that this is fake, that the whole thing is based on a fake premise. And he continually comes out and says, I want to know how all this started. Who started all this? Why is he pushing this so hard to find out who started it and who did all of this?
Well, I think it should be obvious if it weren't for the obfuscation from the media. But what you've had is a coup attempt against the president. Trump keeps saying it. They're trying to illegally remove an elected president. And this is something that is one of the biggest political scandals in American history. What Trump is focused on right now, which is very interesting, is the British, Ukraine, and Australia. And these three countries were involved in the operations against him. That is the intelligence community in these countries. Australia, of course, is part of the Five Eyes intelligence operation. Ukraine has essentially been under a British CIA control since the coup in 2014. But some of the stories that are emerging just are slam dunk proof that, number one, Mueller's a liar, that he put together a report that's filled with lies and knowable lies. And number two, that if you peel back the lies, you're going to start getting to something interesting, which is, why was this done? And I wish Trump would actually go a step further and say he knows why it was done, to stop him from working with Putin and Xi Jinping and possibly some leaders in Europe to put this collapsing financial system into bankruptcy reorganization, shut down the control of the central banks, and move toward a cooperation around physical economic development. That's what Trump ran on in his presidential campaign, and that's what Russiagate was designed to stop. So, I can elaborate a few of these things, but I think just to put the story out there, what we're seeing is Trump fighting successfully against a coup that was run by a gang of corrupt officials from the Obama administration, people like Clapper, Comey, Brennan, but also people in the State Department, and going back to the Hillary's time there, and their link up with these British networks, which produced the Christopher Steele report. But higher up, Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, is right in the center of this. And they didn't stop with Russiagate. They're the ones who are trying to set up the false flag war with Iran, and possibly more. So, I think if you peel this back, what Trump is saying, let Durham and Barr do their work, get the investigation, find out who are the people who did it, and then get to the question of why, the motives. And if we do that, we can save this country from this gang of corrupt thieves and murderers.
Let me ask you this, because I've been saying this for quite a while now. The deep state, they're continually pushing the Russian story, even though the Mueller report came out and it said no collusion, no obstruction, nothing like that. But they won't let the Russian story go, or the obstruction story. They're continuing with it. If the Russian story falls apart and it turns out to be false, which we all know it's false, but if it comes out that, there is no Russian story here, Russia didn't hack anything, Russia didn't do anything, what happens to everything else they've been talking about, like the DNC server, WikiLeaks, the DCCC, and the rest? Doesn't that all just completely go down the drain for them? Isn't everything based on this Russian story?
Of course, and that's why it's so important that it's being challenged and being beaten back. The Russia story was the big concoction that was done on the surface by the Clinton campaign, but a lot of people focus on Hillary as the kingpin. She's not a kingpin. She's a stupid, corrupt puppet, very corrupt. And behind her, you have these financial circles who don't want to see their control lost. Now, this is where you can take a look at these deeper questions. Just for example, Mueller in his report still contends that there was a lie. He still contends that the Russians hacked the DNC. This is totally based on something by a company called CrowdStrike, which is run by an anti-Putin guy, Alperovitz. But CrowdStrike just admitted, again, that they never produced a final report on alleged Russian hacking. The FBI had to tell Roger Stone's attorneys, because Roger is doing an excellent job contesting this, they had to tell Stone's attorneys that the FBI never saw unredacted reports on CrowdStrike's forensics, probably because CrowdStrike never did any forensics. They just did an assertion. So if this lie of Russian intervention in the U.S. campaign is thrown out, then everything that's been said in the last 2.5 years about Russia is called into question. Now, let me just make two quick other points on this that show that Mueller was intending to run this anti-Russian thing and not expecting to be countered. The case of Konstantin Klimenik, who was the business partner of Manafort. John Solomon just did an excellent report on some documents that came out through the Freedom of Information Act, which show that Klimenik was not only not a Putin agent or a Russian agent, he was working since 2013 with the State Department in Ukraine, in Kiev, which means he was intersecting the circles of Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland, the people who ran the coup. Furthermore, it shows that Klimenik was working with people like Jonathan Weiner in the State Department, who were the people who were pushing the Christopher Steele report. And how did they know Steele? Steele submitted 100 memos on Ukraine between 2013 and 2014. That's why Trump's bringing up Ukraine. So on page 6 of the Mueller report, he cites Klimenik as evidence of the Russian involvement with Trump. And now this story comes out that completely blows that out of the water. The other story is the funny one of the Felix Sater, supposedly Michael Cohen's childhood buddy who was going to build the Moscow Tower, Trump Tower in Moscow for Trump under Putin's control. Sater, first of all, never contacted Putin. He was never in contact with anyone at the Kremlin. Secondly, since 1998, he's been an operative with ties to Andrew Weissman, who ran an investigation and a conviction of him as a financial swindler in New York City. And to stay out of jail, Sater signed himself over to the FBI. So the other source on Russia, one is a State Department agent, another is an FBI agent. I mean, it becomes laughable. And if these strings are pulled, the whole suit of clothing falls apart.
So none of these individuals were Russian. All these individuals were informants like Mifsud and the rest. I mean, you just named the others, but none of them were Russian. Can we find any Russians?
Well, Sater was, I think, born in Russia, and Klimenik is Ukrainian. But the important thing is that also the so-called 12 GRU agents who supposedly ran the Facebook operation and the hacking, none of this is true. Guccifer 2, complete fraud, as Bill Binney has exposed. So the whole thing was a fraud. And yet the American people have been subjected 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to breathless media anchors talking about the latest expose about Trump's Russian connection and the corruption of Manafort and on and on and on. It's all a fraud. And if we can expose it, this ends the domination of the so-called mainstream media, because all of them participated in the fraud. Most of the intelligence services, not all of the people in the intelligence services, but most of the leaders are corrupted and are part of this. The whole State Department has to be taken apart because of their involvement in this. So I think the collapse of the Mueller report is going to be one of the most important cleansing mechanisms we've had, and it may actually lead to something that people voted for in 2016, namely draining the swamp.
Yeah, I agree. So you mentioned Barr before with Durham, and Trump gave Barr the ability to move ahead with the investigation, to declass, and Barr went ahead and brought in Durham. What is Durham actually investigating right now?
Well, you have two things. One is you have the Horowitz, who's doing supposedly a thorough investigation of the use of the Steele dossier and the FISA filings in September of 2016. Now, Durham's going beyond that. Durham's looking at who in the FBI was involved in this, what they were saying, what their connections were, what were the connections between the FBI and the CIA in this, because Brennan was the person who was originally pushing this, going back to some stories in 2015 that originated where? In London with the GCHQ, the NSA equivalent in Britain. Their leader, Hannigan, came over in the spring of 2016. But before that, he was talking to Brennan about so-called irregular evidence of Russian cyber activity in the United States. Brennan, and it's interesting, Hannigan went to Brennan instead of Mike Rogers, who was the head of the NSA, who he ordinarily would have worked through, because there was a fix-in with Brennan. And Brennan was the one who then, with Clapper, got Comey on board. But we've seen, Dave, you and I have talked about this before. Look at the FBI, people like Andrew McCabe, Comey, Peter Strzok, Baker, the chief attorney for the FBI. There's so many of these operatives who were involved in this, who were openly talking about having an insurance policy against Trump becoming president. So I think what Durham is doing is putting the squeeze on. Now, there's a very significant development that happened when Trump was in London, which is that Christopher Steele agreed that he would sit for some questioning. And I'm not sure if it's with Horowitz, the Inspector General of the DOJ, or with Durham. Now I'm told it's with Durham. But Steele asked that it be limited to his dealings with the FBI. Well, that's a good place to start, because the FBI was actually paying Christopher Steele along with Hillary Clinton paying him. But what's interesting about it is the London Times asked the British government if they were involved in Steele's decision to testify, and they said no. Why should we be? He's been out of our service for years. Now, a year ago, when he was called in for depositions in a civil case, the British sent their top attorney from their intelligence community into the court with him to protect him and to protect state secrets. Now the London Times is saying they're not going to protect him anymore, which means maybe Steele will tell a lot more about how this whole thing was set up and coordinated with Mifsud, with Halper, with Alexander Downer, this whole crew of FBI shared assets with British intelligence who concocted this whole fabricated story.
So do you see many of these operatives turning now on all of this? I mean, do you think they're going to be coming forth because, hey, listen, I don't want to get caught up in this and I don't want everything to be blamed on me? Do you think they're coming forward and giving certain information to get themselves out of this?
I think some of them are. There's a report that James Baker, who is the chief attorney for the FBI, has said some things that are quite interesting. The report in the New York Times on Steele accepting being questioned said that there's great fear in London that if Steele turns, other people might turn, and this could affect such things as the Skripal case or the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which keeps reporting false news on Assad's use of chemical weapons. There's so much that's connected with this. The Ukraine coup. What was the involvement of these same networks, these very same people? Christopher Steele, Jonathan Weiner, John Kerry, in the Ukraine coup that brought neo-Nazis into power and led to the escalation of tensions between the U.S. and Russia. I hope that Durham is the real deal. But in the meantime, as long as Trump stays out front, keeping the focus on the British, the Australians, the Ukrainians, demanding that there be a full accounting, we have an opportunity to have some of these people marched into jail.
So do you think that Barr, when he was testifying in Congress, do you think he went out of his way to say that there was spying? Do you think he did this on purpose to get the ball rolling?
I think he was just being honest. if you look at what was done to set up the whole question of the FISA warrant that began the spying, or the surveillance, if you want to use the technical term, Barr looked at it and said, this is spying. And it is. You take the Mifsud case. Here's a guy who may be a shared asset of Italian intelligence, British intelligence, and the CIA. Mueller calls him a Russian operative. He has nothing to do with Russia. But what's interesting is the Italian government just fired 2 of their top intelligence people for their cooperation with the CIA against Trump. So I think this is becoming an international story, and it's going to be very difficult for the mainstream media to contain it.
So why doesn't Barr just declassify everything and just put it all out there and say, okay, here's the declassification. This is what we know. This is what we have. What do you think they're waiting for?
What I'm hoping is that they want people to squirm and come forward with more evidence. I think as much as you can put together a case of evidence right now, it would be a whole lot better if you had a couple of these top people involved who came and said, like Comey did. No, it was Brennan and Clapper who told me to use the Christopher Steele report. And then they said, no, it was Comey who did it. So if you can heighten the tension and panic in these networks, some of them will crack. These are people who run wars, who run terrorist operations, but themselves have never been in the line of fire. What happens when someone like Brennan, who's probably a coward on top of being a liar, is faced with jail time? So, hopefully the squeeze is being put on them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think they're trying to get each of them to turn on the other and make them go into panic mode and fear, which makes them do stupid things. And I think you're right. I think that's what they're trying to do.
I would rather have it all spill out quickly, because we're moving inexorably toward war, because the people who ran Russiagate and are now on the defensive because of Russiagate are escalating around Iran. They're escalating around China, around Russia, Venezuela. They've still got the madman Bolton in there. You have Pompeo putting out these obviously, if not faked, at least highly unintelligible videos, basically leading toward a war mobilization. It was just announced today 1,000 U.S. troops are going to be sent into the Middle East. Remember, Trump 8 months ago said we're going to start pulling out of Syria and Afghanistan, and now we're increasing the troop levels. So they're trying to do everything to reverse what Trump intends to do. And so the quicker it happens, the better. The quicker the expose happens, the better.
No, I do agree with you. I think the deep state operatives, they're pushing very hard to start a war or to have Trump do something. But I think Trump understands this. I think he understands what they're trying to do. And the troops that are going into the Middle East, 1,000 troops, that was announced by acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan. But he just resigned, which I find very interesting. And of course, he says, he wants to be with his family and stuff. But I'm wondering if the plans that he had, maybe he's tied to the deep state or whatever, they're not going as what he thought, where he thought these plans were going to go. Because Trump over and over says he doesn't want war. And I don't think he's a war monger where he wants war. I think he's a negotiator. And I think he understands that these individuals, they'll do whatever they have to try to start a war. And I know that he has Bolton, Pompeo in these positions, but I personally think he puts these people in these positions for a specific reason. We know that Bolton is a neocon. We know that he would love to have war with Iran. We know that he would love to have regime change in Venezuela and Iran. And I believe he put him out front to keep the deep state, to keep the mainstream media very, very busy reporting that. And I believe that behind the scenes, just like North Korea, behind the scenes, Trump is working out a new deal with Iran. Because right now, Iran, listen, they gave Europe an ultimatum. They're breaking a lot of their commitments. And I see it moving in a different direction where Trump understands that the deep state's going to try to start a war. He needs this to cover everything that he's trying to do behind the scenes. And I think in maybe a week or 2 weeks or whatever, I think we're going to hear something very different come out of Iran. And it's not what the mainstream media wants. It's not what the deep state wants. I think we're going to hear a new deal coming out of Iran very, very soon.
Well, there are signs that point in that direction, but I just would warn people to keep in mind that you're dealing with a crowd which has launched wars before. The wars of the 20th century were run by these geopoliticians. And one example of what happened is Trump met with Japanese Prime Minister Abe. And Abe then went to Tehran. First time in, I think, 4 decades that a Japanese leader had been in Iran. We don't know exactly what the discussions were, but he said they were good. Rouhani said they were good. Abe may have very well been taking a message to the Iranians from Trump. And as soon as Abe leaves, you have this incident in the Gulf of Oman. Now, one of the tip-offs of how insane it would be for Iran to have done that is one of the tankers that was hit was a Japanese tanker. Is it possible that the Iranians are so stupid that they would do something like that after this initiative from Trump and Abe? So I think you've got a deep state that's out of control. Now, fortunately, up to this point, Trump has repeatedly intervened. For example, his phone call with Putin about a little more than a month ago, where he and Putin had a 90-minute discussion, a very good, solid discussion. His discussion just 2 days ago with Xi Jinping to confirm that they're going to meet at the Osaka, Japan G20. His exchange of letters with Kim Jong-un. There's a lot that Trump is doing, but the parallel, and this is something that Mrs. LaRouche brought up a couple of days ago, is what happened when Kennedy got blindsided by the way the Bay of Pigs was run, that the operation was in place and it was being run behind his back. Now, I think an interesting thing that came out today is that Trump is demanding that the New York Times reveal their sources on this story of U.S. cyber attacks on Russia. I think that's important because this does look like another false report from the New York Times designed to scuttle a meeting between Trump and Putin at the G20 summit. So rather than speculate on how much Trump knows or doesn't know, it's clear he does know a lot and he's doing a lot, but he needs help. He needs a Republican Party not to go along with these damn neocons like this idiot senator from Arkansas, Cotton, who's basically calling for bombing Iran. He's trying to repeat John McCain's song on this. But I think the American people have to kick the warmongers in the rear end, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, media. The American people don't want war. And that's what got Trump elected, a big part of what got him elected. And he's got to make the case and keep fighting it, but we've got to give him backup on that.
Yeah, I mean, with the New York Times article, which I find very interesting, where they just came out and said, yes, the U.S. is, planting malware or trying to hit the power grid of Russia. To me, I could see where they could take this. I could see where the warmongers could take this. They could say, hey, listen, we have malware in there, and they could say the U.S. did something, and Russia, maybe a city, a little town, the power goes down or whatever, and all of a sudden, Russia's saying, oh, wow, look at this. The United States did something. And the deep state would hope that Russia would then retaliate against the United States in some way, somehow, maybe a cyber attack or something to get something started. But the problem is that Putin doesn't react in that fashion. Trump doesn't react in that fashion. The deep state, they react like that. Oh, you just crossed a red line. Oh, we have to go to war. But if you notice, Putin and Trump, they're more, all right, let's talk about this for a second. Let's think about this for a second, because think about the past. How many times could we have gone to war with Russia and Putin never, pushed that at all? He always tried to push peace instead. And I think the deep state, they're trying all their war tricks. The one with Iran, actually the individuals on the tanker, on the Japanese tanker, they're saying it was a flying object. It wasn't even a mine. So that counters the argument of a mine. I know they're showing pictures and the grainy black and white and all that other stuff, and they even have closer up ones of we don't know exactly
Dave,
what it is.
let me just give you another example of this war drive. Luke Harding, the completely discredited journalist from The Guardian who wrote a book called Collusion and was one of the leading promoters of impeachment in the British press, he's now got a story out saying that Russia has military plans to, quote, take over Russia. Quite amazing that you have this coming from these sources that are completely discredited, who are doubling or tripling down. Now, let me just add one other element to this, which is, I think, something that people cannot ignore, which is that we're coming to a new inflection point in the financial crisis. And the G20 summits are notoriously incompetent at handling economic matters. But something happened that I think raised eyebrows all over Europe, or two things happened. One is the head of the European Central Bank reconfirmed the commitment not only to quantitative easing, but starting to talk about negative interest rates. In other words, it's basically paying banks to take their money. And this occurred the same day Deutsche Bank announced that they're going to offload 50 billion euros of assets, mostly derivatives, into a bad bank. Now, this is the old Enron model, the special investment vehicle where you unload bad assets so they can't be preyed upon, but you don't have to immediately produce anything because people aren't going to demand that they be repaid. But what it shows is they have no plan for either reinvigorating investment in the economy or sustaining the levels of debt. Now, are they going to start writing off all that debt? Well, that would be a good step, but they're afraid to do that. Then you have the whole debate over interest rates at the Fed, which shows that underneath some elements of improvement in the economy, you still have the same systemic problem that brought it down in February 2008. So I think these are some of the factors that are driving Trump to try to take advantage of the opportunity to meet with Xi and Putin and others and push this idea of how do we move out of this financial system dominated by Wall Street and the City of London and Brussels. And in Europe, there's just turmoil in Europe because every political party is collapsing. I mean, it's ironic with all the attacks on Trump, he's more stable than any leader in Europe right now.
Let me ask you this. We know that Trump, he had a phone call with Xi. They're going to be meeting at the G20. Do you think they're going to hammer out a deal during the G20?
Well, I think what they both are going to do is come with proposals to break the deadlock that occurred after it appeared as though a deal was imminent. And I think they're going to have to do it in a fairly clever way, a step-by-step way. But I think both of them want a deal because they both realize that there are some weaknesses in the financial system overall that could have enormous implications in the U.S. and China if we end up decoupling our economies. And so both of them have more to gain by working together than by having a confrontation. Now, this gets back, though, to the anti-China lobby, which is huge. And what's the whole anti-China lobby? They're defending the old paradigm, the old system. They don't want investment in physical production. They want speculation and dollars flowing around the world into the quickest speculative swindle they can find. And what I think the Chinese have objected to the United States about, one of the leading objections they have, is they don't want U.S. banking rules to take over China because they see what happens. Look at our American cities. Look at the Rust Belt. Look at the farms in the United States. Look at the infrastructure. There's no investment, and there's no intention to invest. The Democrats say they're going to invest in infrastructure, and then they call Trump a crook. Trump makes an outreach to them for having to have an infrastructure plan, and then they scuttle it. And in his own party, the Republicans don't want an infrastructure spending either. So the system as a whole is stuck on the edge of a cliff. And it's going to take some very good negotiating and some good cooperation to get us off the cliff and then start growing again. But I think that's what's at stake. And if they could do that at the same time avoiding these wars, breaking the power of the neoconservatives and the neoliberals on finance, then we're talking about a whole new strategic situation.
I think that Xi and Putin and Trump, I think they have the central bank system in an incredible once-in-a-lifetime spot, because right now, if there's no war or anything like that, then the central bankers don't get an event. To me, it seems like the central bank is completely exposed. I know they're blaming the slowdown on the tariffs and the conflict with China, with Xi and Trump, where they can't make a deal. But once they make a deal and then tariffs are removed, the central bank, to me, it seems like they're in trouble because they have nothing to hide behind. It's their system that they created that's imploding around the world. The debt level is just way too high. Their system was never meant to go this far, and everything is crashing in around them. And this is why you hear the ECB saying, listen, we need more stimulus. We need to go to negative interest rates, because that's all they have. If they don't do this.
The debt date is almost 60% higher than it was in 2008. And of the corporate debt, somewhere close to 45% of it is triple B status, which is one level above junk bond. And this is what is causing nightmares for the Federal Reserve, because you have these corporations whose stock has been appreciating while their actual real value is collapsing. And so you're right, it's the system. It's a systemic problem. And, this is what one of the advantages that I have in looking at this is having worked with Lyndon LaRouche for 40 years, because he always approached things from the standpoint of the system. He said, you have to look at the flaws in the system and realize that the system itself is a flaw, that the Bretton Woods system, as it was set up by Franklin Roosevelt, while it had some good aspects to it, like a gold reserve, like fixed exchange rates, it was sabotaged by the Keynesians and the British monetarists. And it had cracks built within it that opened the door, especially after the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, for the speculators to take over everything, including the government, including the Congress. And so now we're at a point, I agree with you absolutely, people are beginning to recognize that the political problems are related to the economic problems, the financial problems. And we have a job to do to educate people. And one of the things I just want to announce is that as of Friday, LaRouche PAC is going to be putting out a new document, which is a documentary, I should say, on Lyndon LaRouche, Robert Mueller's first hit. And it's going to go through why LaRouche was targeted by the deep state, including Mueller himself in the mid-1980s, when he was first appointed U.S. Attorney in Boston. His first case was the Get LaRouche Task Force. And so they've been targeting LaRouche for 45 years with the same slanders and attacks that were deployed against Trump. Now, LaRouche spent 5 years in prison. We didn't have the resources and the capability to fight the way that Trump does. But Trump needs to take the full lesson of the LaRouche case and apply it in his case, which is you've got to go for the scalps now.
Today, we have to go after them full force and get rid of all of it all at the same time. Because if we don't do that, if we don't go after the swamp, the central bank and everything else and remove it, because I do believe the central bank is the source of most of the problems that we have today. I do believe that we need to get rid of that. I'm talking about the private Western Central Bank, where, it's a private corporation. And I think we need to go after that. If we had a system without a private Western Central Bank, where we're not borrowing the money anymore and we're creating the currency ourselves with no interest attached, what kind of world would we have today?
Remember, in 1963, John Kennedy started moving in that direction. In June of 63, when the Federal Reserve was refusing to make credit available for a modernization of the steel industry, Kennedy went ahead and created treasury bills. And he was talking about a much larger flow of funds. I think the decision to assassinate him was related to, on the one side, his moves toward a change with the policy toward the Soviet Union and to end the power of the CIA. But directly related to that was his attack on the Federal Reserve System. So we could have had that transformed in the 1960s. So we've lost a lot of time. And you look at the United States, which coming out of World War II and in the 50s and 60s, we were the envy of the world, the greatest manufacturing nation, food producing nation. We were a good nation. We were rebuilding infrastructure. And now you look at it, and really you look at the major cities in the Midwest, even the big new cities. You have a lot of glitz and cover of in New York and places like that look wealthy, but look how many people live. How much of the U.S. population is desperate and facing the prospect that they're 1 month away from losing their home. So we've got to make that change. And this is why, the fight that I've been waging and the LaRouche PAC has been waging is that we have to take on the deep state at the same time we put forward a real economic recovery plan, restoring Glass-Steagall, going back to a national credit policy with whether you call it a national bank or a Hamiltonian credit bank, a bank which is not controlled by the banksters, but which is controlled by the people through the Congress, that will make credit available for the projects that are necessary to build productive value, to have real value added to the economy. So these things are connected, and we have a golden opportunity now, provided enough of us are out front with the solutions.
Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see all your work?
Well, people can send me an email, a personal email, to harleysch@gmail.com. I receive a lot of emails from X22 Report listeners and have very lively back and forth on some of them. So if you want to contact me, I'll give you a link to my blog page for free. If you write to me at harleysch, that's HARLEYSCH @gmail.com.
Great. Harley, once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.